cluster bombs and vacuum bombs being used by the Russians. If that's true, what is the next step of this administration, and is there a red line for how much violence will be tolerated against civilians in this manner that's illegal and potentially a war crime?
It would be. I don't have any confirmation of that. We have seen the reports. If that were true, it would potentially be a war crime. Obviously, there are a range of international fora that would assess that. So certainly we would look to that to be a part of that conversation.
This is what rained from the skies: cluster bombs, large shells containing hundreds of smaller bombs. The US dropped 260 million of these on Laos. The target was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply route for communist forces in neighbouring Vietnam. It was someone else's war. Officially, Laos wasn't even involved. But its land and its people were blown to pieces. The bombing was so widespread here in Laos that the remnants of the attacks have just become part of daily life. These are shell casings which were used to hold some of the cluster bombs. But the numbers behind this bombing campaign are still staggering. It was the equivalent of one bombing mission every 8 minutes for 9 years. One way to try and get your head around it is to think that in the time it will take you to watch this program, the people of Laos would have been bombed 4 times. The countryside looks peaceful now, but there's still danger. Imagine what it's like to be a farmer here, ploughing and planting land that's contaminated by bombs. Up to 30% of the munitions dropped on Laos didn't detonate. That means there are up to 80 million bomblets in the soil that can explode at any time. This is what the tiny cluster bombs look like. This one's been made safe so that I can handle it. You can see that they're only about the size of a tennis ball, but they're deadly. And the thing that's really frightening about those that haven't exploded is that when they're on the ground, they are incredibly difficult to see.
During a week-long investigation on the ground in eastern Ukraine, Human Rights Watch has found widespread use of cluster munitions. Our evidence shows that the Ukrainian armed forces were responsible for at least some of these attacks. In the incidents documented by Human Rights Watch, cluster munitions killed at least 6 civilians and injured dozens.
В это время упала эта бомба, вот тут вот. Если хотите, могу эту яму показать. И взорвалась, и прямо в окно. В окно, как его, она стояла возле окна. И разбила окно, этот осколок, и вот так вот сонная артерия перерезала. Я пришел, а я оттуда иду, тут люди. Ага. Я пошел, хотел туда идти, а там смотрю, люди кричат: дядя Ваня, тетю Раю убила.
The cluster munitions that Human Rights Watch has documented in eastern Ukraine are surface-to-surface weapons. They're rockets. And within those rockets, there are dozens of submunitions or smaller bombs which explode when they hit the ground. The problem with cluster munitions is that they cover a wide area. And anybody who is in that area, whether they're civilians or combatants, run the risk of being injured and killed. And that is why it is an inherently indiscriminate weapon.
Упал вот это, почувствовал, что заложило уши, и увидел, как со спины вот это закрывает пылью, землею, как волна как накрывала. Да, пробито одно легкое. Сейчас потихоньку восстанавливается, но еще не до конца.
The first clue that cluster munitions have been used is usually the presence of multiple impact craters with a very distinctive fragment pattern.
After the detonation of the submunition, the fragments are ejected and these melt, they melt into the asphalt as they come out.
At these impact sites, we also find very often remnants of the submunitions or of the rockets themselves. And witnesses also told us what it sounded like when the attack happened, that it was multiple smaller explosions, which is typical of a cluster munitions attack, instead of single larger ones.
А вы помните, какой звук был, когда это упало? Вы можете описать звук?
Гул такой. И так и начали бух-бух-бух сыпаться. Они оттуда начали лететь, сыпаться, и вот так пошло.
Since all the parties to the conflict in eastern Ukraine use the same weapons, it's sometimes difficult to establish with certainty responsibility for a single attack. But for several attacks on Donetsk in early October, we have very strong evidence that it was the Ukrainian armed forces. The impact site showed that these rockets came from the southwest, and when we went there to areas controlled by the Ukrainian government forces, we found misfired rockets that showed that the rockets came from that area.
We are in the middle of a sunflower field about 16 to 18 kilometers south of Donetsk. This confirms to us that we're in the flight path and the areas that Ukrainian military forces are firing surface-to-surface rockets into Donetsk. And also confirms to us that they're using cluster munitions among these rockets.
Another problem with cluster munitions is that sometimes these submunitions fail to explode on impact. But they're very unstable, so if they get disturbed, they might explode and kill and injure civilians. And we saw dozens of such unexploded submunitions during our investigation in eastern Ukraine. 114 countries have signed a treaty to ban the use of cluster munitions. And although Ukraine is not one of those countries, firing cluster munitions into populated areas is still a violation of the laws of war and may amount to war crimes.
So the bottom line is this. We recognize that cluster munitions create a risk of civilian harm from unexploded ordnance. This is why we've deferred the decision for as long as we could. But there is also a massive risk of civilian harm if Russian troops and tanks roll over Ukrainian positions and take more Ukrainian territory and subjugate more Ukrainian civilians because Ukraine does not have enough artillery. That is intolerable to us. Ukraine would not be using these munitions in some foreign land. This is their country they're defending. These are their citizens they're protecting. And they are motivated to use any weapon system they have in a way that minimizes risks to those citizens.
So it's July of 2023. I'm struck by his foreign policy views. Trump is the only person with stature in the Republican Party, really, who's saying, wait a second, why are we supporting an endless war in Ukraine? And that, leaving aside whether Trump's going to get the nomination or get elected president or would be a good president, I can't even assess that. All I can say at this point is I'm so grateful that he has that position. He's right. And everyone in Washington's wrong. Everyone. And Trump is right on that question. And it's a big question. That war is reshaping the world. It's reshaping the economy of the world. It's reshaping populations. I was just in Romania last week, which is, of course, shares a border with Ukraine. The refugees in that region, the number of people killed in that war, Europe will never be the same because of this war. And it really matters.